I don't know what our advantage is to break this magical barrier.
I will use my anti-trait.
Wait, what's your anti-trait?
I am not a subtle infiltrator.
That is not how anti-traits work. Story point. We're gonna die here.
Grimwild is a tabletop RPG by Oddity Press, written by J.D. Maxwell and illustrated by Per Janka. It was published in 2025 after a successful crowdfunding campaign. At the time of recording, only the digital version is available, but there's something interesting about that I want to address in a minute. In this video, I want to discuss the reasons why I think this game is the ultimate form of story-first Dungeons & Dragons. Design-wise, it's sort of based on Blades in the Dark with elements of Torchbearer, Fate, and Cortex Prime. But if you're not familiar with these games, it's essentially a game that prioritizes everyone telling an interesting story that moves along more than simulating combat and inventory and gear minutia. Essentially, it's the D&D that a lot of people new to D&D wish they were playing after watching the highly abstracted experience on Critical Role and Stranger Things. They want to jump in and tell a fantasy story together, not track feats and proficiency bonuses and roll for perception to see if they notice something or not in a scene that's critical to moving the story forward. I'm going to list the things in this game that I think make it superior to Wizards of the Coast's 5e Dungeons & Dragons, and at the end of this video, I'll also give you my thoughts on the nature of this game after having played it. But it's important to note that I also did a written interview with the author, J.D. Maxwell, on my newsletter in which I do almost nothing but question him with my criticisms and concerns about the game's mechanics, playability, and runnability. In other words, this video has all the positives I observed about this game, and the interview contains all the potential negatives, accompanied by the author's defense and explanation on each point. It's up to you how deep you want to explore my exploration of this game, but I thought it was a fun way to do it this way. And fortunately, JD was happy to oblige.
Real quick, adventurer, if you appreciate this content and want more, consider chipping in a few dollars to the Dave Thaumavore RPG Reviews Patreon. The primary reason is to help the channel grow, but there's also a Patreon-only Discord for supporters. There I share extra behind-the-scenes details, plus more candid takes on games, the gaming industry, technology, and pop culture. Most importantly, I listen to your opinions and suggestions there first. If you'd like to keep these reviews going strong, and maybe help shape them, join the Patreon and the Discord!
Let's jump into this list of why Grimwild is better than WotC's 5e. The illustrated PDF is free. The free digital version of this game is about 140 pages, while the paid digital version is $20 and only 30 pages more. Now, I'm not trying to discourage you from buying the full version, but most of the magic that makes this game the unique sort of paradigm shift in narrative gaming that it is freely available for download. The only thing that you're not getting with the free version is some extra GM tools and game design discussion. Oh, and the game is given to you under the Creative Commons BY 4.0 license, which WotC's 5e SRD is also now under, so I can't count that as a point for Grimwild, but still, that means you can reskin this game and do all kinds of fun stuff with it. It tells you how to be a good player. You may have seen some of this advice in Grimwild's predecessors, but I wish all 5e players would get this drilled into their brains. It comes down to this: don't be a weasel, as in, don't try to game the system in the course of play with your rolls. Separate character and player knowledge. This is sort of an extension of not being a weasel. Just play the story out. Use meta channel sparingly. Don't make a big deal out of the rules, discussions, and debates. That's a real mood killer. And know the rules. Is it weird to ask that from players? Is there really any other alternative? Dead simple dice resolution. For any tests, you are always ever only rolling 1 to 3 d6s and maybe up to 3 d8s. You will take the highest rolled d6 out of any roll. A result of 1, 2, or 3 is a grim, which is like a failure. A 4 or 5 is a messy, which is a mixed success. And a 6 is a perfect success. 2 6s in a roll is a critical success. Sometimes you're up against something tough or there's a disadvantage of one sort or another, in which case you roll up to 3 d8s called thorns. If a thorn comes up a 7 or an 8, that reduces your overall success for the roll by 1 step. So between all these possibilities, your outcome could range from critical success to disaster. Montage and story rolls to skip the BS. If everyone knows the next scene or stretch of the story is probably going to be uneventful, one or more players can just roll a few dice and assess the roll as if it were a test and narrate accordingly. No need to play out the BS scenes that are boring. Diminishing pools. Okay, this is just randomly stuck in here as number 5, but it's actually one of the most interesting and fun things about this game, and it's pretty central to the game's mechanics. And it's one you can steal and use in any RPG if you like it. Basically, instead of using a clock where you tick down a little timer each round or each day or whatever in order to track a countdown towards something or the depletion of a resource, instead you use dice pools of varying sizes. When it's time to check the countdown or resource or whatever, you roll the whole pool of d6s. Any dice that come up 1, 2, or 3 are eliminated from the pool, and when that pool is eventually completely depleted, the timer or resource runs out. But it's not just timers and resources. This mechanic is applied all over the place in this game because it's random, swingy, and fun, but still has some statistical heft to it. An 8 dice pool, for example, is just going to last longer than a 2 dice pool, usually. Here's a really great example of diminishing pools in use. Challenges in this game are presented only in the barest of terms, but they carry a lot of potential drama with diminishing pools. In a case like this, the party will work towards making rolls against this 6 dice pool to stop the ritual, but interestingly, there's a competing pool of 4 dice that, if completed, will see the completion of the ritual in the fiction. That's so much storytelling described in so few words and numbers here. Anti-details. Your character isn't just made up of core traits and desires. There are always traits and desires that they do not have. I remember seeing this once before in Wanderhome, the notion of an anti-trait, but I haven't seen it since. It's a very powerful way to describe your character, and it's very clearly denoted on your character sheet. Story points. There is absolutely nothing new about metacurrency, even 5e has them by default, but story points in this game can be used to completely add a new detail to a scene. The GM does have veto power if a player is trying to alter a scene too much, but the idea here is to arm everyone with the power to tell a fun collaborative story, not to play out a game with victory conditions. Story points used by players means the game trusts the players to be creative and fair, and is a departure from the traditional notion of dungeon master as god. Players have final say on permanent damage. The GM does not have the power in this game to unilaterally narrate permanently disfiguring injuries on PCs. This is carving out something akin to a bill of rights for players, one of them in this case being the right to a character's corpus unmaimed. The only way I can see this as being a problem is if the fiction obviously dictates that the PC is badly injured, but the player is too attached to their character to let that happen. In that case, you have to go back and point to the sign that says, "Don't be a weasel," or maybe to put it less harshly, put the story first. The only reason you have the right as a player to deny major disfigurement is because the game entrusts you with the power to tell an awesome story. Don't violate that trust. Quarrels. More than just WotC's 5e, I think most RPGs have this problem of not having any mechanics in place to quickly and fairly resolve player versus player conflicts. The unspoken covenant is that it's either not supposed to happen or it's supposed to be just relegated to roleplay and not rolling the dice against each other. In Grimwild, a PC versus PC dispute can be resolved with the Quarrel rule, which resolves things with a simple roll of the dice. And this is yet another brilliant little micro mechanic that you can use to enhance any RPG that you want. Simple leveling. You get 1 XP per session by default, and maybe a bonus XP if the session was particularly spectacular. If you want to slow things down, you can award half a box per session, and the milestone rewards on the character sheet are as clear as day. Character sheets tell all. The fact is, the 1-page character sheet encapsulates most of what you need to know for your character type. When it comes to magic and narrative details, you'll have plenty to write down, but at least you don't have to transcribe or reference class talents, which are all just right there on the sheet. Rules are 22 pages, and those pages are spaciously laid out, bulleted, and end with 4 full pages of extended rules examples. Now, I have to confess that this game's rules are unique enough with enough new terminology that it's not exactly easy reading, especially if you're not familiar with the Blades in the Dark paradigm of game design, but still, it's 22 pages. Just for reference, the free version of the 5e rules is 403 pages of unbookmarked, unillustrated text wall. I didn't count how many of those pages are actually the game's rules, mostly because the PDF wasn't bookmarked and I couldn't be bothered. But still, Vigilance system. Instead of rolling for perception all the time and having the awkwardness that comes with that, the GM assigns PCs one of 3 levels of awareness based on their character details, and the scene is revealed along those 3 levels. This clears up so much of the mess that perception rolls bring because it can ensure that critical details of a scene are not missed by a bad roll, and it has the bonus of accurately reflecting a PC's likely ability to notice things, rather than leaving it to chance. No turn order. Combat is just played out cinematically. Obviously everyone needs a turn in the spotlight, including the enemies, but this game is not trying to establish a pseudo-realistic simulation of combat like most RPGs. It's trying to portray an interesting battle scene using the narrative details available. You still have to roll for attacks and defense, and you can still take damage, but combat is not at the center of the game. D&D classes boiled down. Instead of being pages and pages of class options and paths, each of the 12 D&D classes, or adventure paths as they're called in this game, is just 2 pages that essentially detail your core talents. Some paths are more complex than others, but not by much. You're just getting all the flavor and feel of each of these classes without the labyrinthine class abilities. Exploration system. There's a simple but fascinating exploration system based on an economy of so-called exploration tokens. As GM and players spend these tokens, they buy the ability to add new paths and locations to the map, essentially creating a point crawl experience. This, as opposed to being given a map that has everything predetermined and written up by unnamed contract writers, with this game, the people at your table are enlisted as the world builders here, but there's actually some mechanical structure to it. Monster blocks are purified essence. This is just the nature of this game and of narrative-heavy games like this, but it's refreshing to see a monster stat block and not be hit with a full page of ability and attack descriptions. At the top is the enemy archetype, which corresponds to different combat tactics later described in the book. Then you have 3 main colors, then traits and moves, then what it does and what it does not want. Again, the anti-detail used here is incredibly effective. Then more sensory words to accompany the colors. And finally, a unique D6 table describing one interesting detail or another. Rather than being hemmed in by a prescriptive list of stats, feats, actions, and bonus actions and whatever, you're just given the core, most important things you need to know about the creature. Okay, to be fair, there are some monster blocks in the book that are a bit more involved. These challenge blocks reflect more serious opponents. Story kits. The game's core book doesn't give you any sample adventures, but rather one-page templates that lay out all the elements to flesh out a full session or multi-session adventure. Since the game empowers the players to come up with so much of the reality of the story, it's kind of impossible to write up an adventure with any predetermined story beats. If you've gotten tired of published adventures that put players on a railroad, this right here is the opposite of that. There are 17 of these one-page adventure incubators, and I think it would take some time and practice to get used to unpacking them as the GM, but once you do, I can't imagine ever going back to pre-written adventures where every NPC and event in the story is written out across 50 to 200 or more pages. Optimized for solo and GMless play, the game is loaded with tables that act as oracles, or what the game calls crucibles, for the GM to roll on or pick from whenever they're stuck without an idea or need some random inspiration. These tables, combined with the simple dice resolution, the open-ended narrative interpretation in much of the game, and things like montage and story rolls, just make this game ready to be played solo or without a GM right out of the gate. There is even a character sheet for solo players to keep track of their 3 minor party members. After playing this game myself, I had a few major takeaways that may encourage or discourage you from wanting to play yourself. The first is that the game is surprisingly brutal. There are some meta currencies floating around that you can use to sometimes bend the dice results, but if you're in a fight and you keep rolling badly, so-called marks can add up fast. It's like Powered by the Apocalypse without the player moves. You truly do whatever you want as a player without having to think about triggering a move. GM uses an economy of suspense points. The GM is also playing the game in a very real way. They earn and spend points of their own in order to impose threats and other antagonistic elements into the narrative. This might take some getting used to as the GM, but in a way it makes it more entertaining for them, since limitations lead to creativity. It also solves a problem that Blades in the Dark and its direct spin-offs have by giving the GM a reason and a way to push the narrative forward anytime there's a stall in the story. The game really doesn't care about your gear. There are clever ways to incorporate a special weapon or something that your character might have, and there are named magical items and potions listed at the back of the book, but generally speaking, the game does not care about whether or not your character has that 50 feet of rope with them. If you're sitting there looking at your character sheet and wondering what you're supposed to do because there's no place to write down how many gold pieces you have and how many weapons you're carrying, the answer is that you're supposed to be thinking about how funny, cool, profound, or interesting you can make the scene that you're currently in. This game is quite focused on telling an entertaining story, but you have to stop thinking about your character's inventory first. So like I said, I have a lot of questions and concerns about Grimwild, and I direct all of them at the author himself. You can read my questions and his answers in the written interview on my newsletter linked below. Please be sure to subscribe to that newsletter so that you don't miss all the interesting interviews that I have with RPG creators. And if you want to support more content like this, consider joining my Patreon. Links for where you can get both the free and full digital version of Grimwild are also below. I'd love to hear your comments on this game and on narrative gaming generally. And thanks as always for watching. I'll see ya.